Madam Rector Magnificus, esteemed faculty board, dear colleagues, friends, family, both present and online. Let me start with a story. At the dawn of philosophy, a minor event took place on the margins of the academy. It's actually not even a story, but a playful anecdote, perhaps even a joke. And yet, it has the serious intent of defining nothing less than who we, humans, actually are and can potentially become. A question at the center of the Humanities, the faculty where my chair is located. The story appears in the lives of eminent philosophers written by Diogenes Laertius in the 3rd century of our era. It recounts how Plato, the founder of a school called the Academy, was applauded by students for his succinct definition of what humans are supposed to be. Plato, Laertius tells us, defined our species as featherless bipeds. Bipeds because we are not condemned to crawl on all fours or sit spellbound by shadows in a cave. Instead, for Plato, humans can stand up, exit the cave, and adopt the position of a Homo erectus, aspiring to reach ideal forms located high up in the sky of ideas. Perhaps sensing a competition with birds, Plato specified that human bipeds are featherless. To reach the ideal world and grasp the wisdom or Sophia that drives philosophy, Plato thought we must rely on spiritual rather than physical wings. Now, to this abstract, idealist, and presumably universal definition, Diogenes Laertius tells us of another, lesser known, but more materialist, down-to-earth, and cynic alternative. Cynicism was, in fact, the philosophical school the second, less vertical philosopher actually belonged to. He was also called Diogenes, Diogenes of Sinope, better known as Diogenes the Cynic. Contra Plato, Diogenes did not propose an abstract definition, but a down-to-earth example. In a gesture that relied more on his body than on language, Diogenes plucked the feathers from a cock, brought it into the lecture room, and shouted, "Here is Plato's man," generating laughter within the academy. Today, in a repetition of Diogenes' ancient gesture, I would like to update the bird in question for modern and contemporary times. Still within academic walls, I hereby proclaim the Dodo as my down-to-earth alternative to Plato's man. To be sure, this flightless and long-extinct bird from a remote island in the Indian Ocean is far from a realistic representative of what humans are. Yet, I suggest that if not the dodo itself, its representations or simulations in modern art, literature, and culture foreshadow all too human challenges central to both modern and contemporary times. I could not find a real dodo, alas. So I brought along a simulacrum. To make his material presence felt. If Plato warned us not to confuse simulacra with reality, I argue that simulations can reveal some truth about Homo sapiens. At this stage, you might wonder, a featherless biped, a plucked cock, and an extinct bird. This sounds like a lecture in ornithology at worst and ancient philosophical gossip at best. Both far removed from modern and contemporary literature and culture, the topic I'm supposed to discuss. Even if you're ready to accept for less than an hour a willing suspension of disbelief that since the Romantic period defines the literary imagination, how can an extinct flightless bird from Mauritius reveal the ongoing importance of studying European literature and culture today? That is, a period haunted by new political, environmental, and technological challenges that urge scholars in the humanities to broaden our definitions of both literature and culture. I realize my example is not ideal, but I'm afraid we do not live in ideal times. As an illustrious precursor, once rector at the University of Leiden, the historian of culture Johann Huizinga famously put it at the beginning of Homo Ludens, a happier age than ours once made bold to call our species by the name Homo sapiens. In the course of time, we have come to realize that we are not so reasonable after all. Hence, the urgency for alternative, down-to-earth definitions of humans to supplement rationalist ideals, which, from Homo sapiens to Homo faber, Homo economicus to Homo digitalis, stretch to include Homo academicus as well. While the Dodo simulacrum does not set up a transparent mirror to sapiens, I argue that it serves as a looking glass to reflect on a mimetic element in culture that gives birth to modern literature and deserves new studies in contemporary media and digital culture. For those not familiar with this flightless bird of Mauritian origins, a brief historical reminder might help. Technically known as Raphus cucullatus, representations of the dodo had already become popular as an icon of extinction in the 19th century, as Jolyon Parrish writes in The Dodo and the Solitaire, the most comprehensive natural history of the dodo to date. First discovered by the Dutch in 1598, at the dawn of the modern era, the dodo had become extinct by 1662. Half a century of interactions with sapiens, and gone was the dodo. Here is a picture of all too human gestures that, without words, say a lot about our species. Already by the mid-19th century, then, the dodo was doubly removed from Europe, both geographically and historically. A distant memory of the colonial past discovered on a remote island named in the honor of a Dutch king, Maurits van Oranje, hence Mauritius. And yet, if not the dodo itself, the phantom of the dodo continued to haunt the modern imagination. Initially, it did so via a representation that set up an unflattering mirror to violent colonial drive, central not only to Dutch history, but to the history of European civilization. These pictures are not realistically reflecting the dodo itself, but they urge us to reflect on modern European culture. In my career, I've argued that modernist European literature plays a central role in this critical self-reflection. It is perhaps a coincidence that the modernist writer who has occupied me most over the past 20 years started his career as a sailor and visited Mauritius. He did so in 1888, when the dodo was already long gone, and wrote a novella titled A Smile of Fortune, involving a love affair with a Mauritian girl named Alice. Of Polish origins and writing in his third language, he would later become severely critical of the horrors of colonialism. As he puts it, I quote him, "They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much." My students who take the course on European modernism will have recognized both the author and text in question. In Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad, the sailor turned writer, depicts the horrors of Belgian colonialism in the Congo. His perspective is not free from ethnocentric bias, as Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe famously noted. At the same time, Conrad also urges us to reflect critically on what the French philosopher Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe called l'horreur occidentale, or the horror of the West. The methodological point I inherited from Lacoue-Labarthe, but also Jean-Luc Nancy, Adriana Cavallero, and other philosopher critics who encouraged me to continue what for a long time seemed like an improbable academic career located at the juncture of philosophy and literature, still drives my work today. Literature and philosophy are not simply rival disciplines, split by what Plato called an ancient quarrel. Rather, they're mirroring disciplines that supplement each other. Once joined, they provide both the experiential affect, or pathos, and the critical discourse, or logos, necessary for diagnosing the pathologies of culture. Thus, in a mirroring reflection that starts from Conrad's modernist tale but reaches into the present, La Coulabart adds, "To recoil from the horror is Western barbarity itself." We begin to see and feel that the mirror of literature captures not only horrors of the past, but also foreshadows present and future crises. These include the recoil from anthropogenic climate change, responsible for what environmental scientists call a sixth species extinction, of which the dodo was an unlucky precursor. Now, I'm aware that in very little time, with the feather of the dodo dipped into the ink of a modernist text, I painted a rather dark picture of Europe. The dodo, in fact, conjures the phantom of extinction that, in the wake of the return of nuclear threats, climate catastrophes, and what philosophers of science call the new atom bomb, namely AI, now cast a shadow on the survival of sapiens as well. But of course, the point of starting with the dodo is precisely the opposite. It's a reminder that this is not the only possibility. Extinction is precisely the fate the dodo simulacrum urges us to avoid. In a logical paradox constitutive of modernism, an icon of human pathologies that led to extinction in the past can become an emblem to promote survival in the future. But we'll have to go through the looking glass of fiction first. A strange mirror that does not simply represent shadows of reality as Plato thought at the dawn of literary criticism. Rather, it sets up a transformative mirror that continues to orient critical reflections in the twilight of the age of print literature. Let me follow Alice's example. Not the Alice Conrad depicts in Mauritius, but a more famous literary Alice. As I first read Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass in a BA course in English literature at the University of Lausanne back in the 1990s, I responded with what I now recognize as an anti-Platonic gesture. I wrote a philosophical essay about it, for I was also following philosophy. Luckily, I was oblivious of the ancient quarrel dividing these disciplines. Even before Heart of Darkness, then, Alice in Wonderland is the text that started my journey at the crossroads of literature and philosophy. After many salti mortali, it led me here today. My examples, you will have noted, betray my academic starting point in English. But I hasten to add that my PhD is in comparative literature. This allowed me to include French, German, and Italian authors drawing on languages which, being Swiss-born, preceded English, my fourth language. They never felt small to me and continue to inform both European and world literature. It would thus be a real loss if a new generation of PhDs in the humanities were no longer able to understand the irony of the phrase "lasciate ogni speranza, voi che entrate," which is inscribed on a door in this building. Multilingualism, as leading Dutch intellectuals from Erasmus to Huizinga to a long chain of my predecessors stressed, is the strongest antidote contra bigotry, intolerance, and fascism, both past and present. This is not a small reason to protect European and non-European languages, already constitutive of Dutch multiculturalism. That said, let me return to Alice. As you may know, the Alice books are dedicated to a real girl named Alice Liddell, with whom Charles Dodgson, the actual name of Lewis Carroll, had a strange fascination. But what made these books interesting to me were their linguistic jokes, logical paradoxes, and philosophical insights about changing identities. This observation, I later realized, was not original. As Gilles Deleuze puts it in Logique du Sens, a book that takes inspiration as much from Lewis Carroll as from ancient philosophers like Stoics, Epicureans, and Cynics, including Diogenes the Cynic, What we find out in the Alice books is what Deleuze calls la première grande mise en scène des paradoxes du sens, the first major staging of the paradoxes of meaning. That is, paradoxes that challenge stable unitary idea based on an unchanging being Plato posited in the sky of ideas, what Nietzsche also calls worlds behind this world, or Hinterwelten. Instead, Carroll, not unlike Nietzsche, but also, we could add, André Gide, Oscar Wilde, Virginia Woolf, Thomas Mann, Georges Bataille, and many other modernist writers I take inspiration from, dramatize a world of constant transformation, metamorphosis, and becoming that, as Deleuze puts it, contests Alice's personal identity. You all remember the story. After following the White Rabbit and tumbling down the rabbit hole, Alice soon realizes that her name no longer suffices to define who she is. Her identity, from Latin identitas, the same, is no longer the same. She shrinks, shoots up like a telescope, then shrinks again. She almost drowns in a pool of her own tears, anticipating a human risk that is perhaps not only fictional. After all, rising sea levels are a threat close to home. Anyway, it is in this fluid, turbulent, to her almost oceanic context that she first meets a party of strange animals. And standing above them, you will remember, is also her flightless bird, the dodo. The dodo and literature are thus not as far removed as those pictures of Mauritius initially suggested. Carroll, for one, or rather Dodgson, had a personal connection to the dodo, not deprived of self-irony. Despite his brilliant wit in writing, as he spoke orally, Dodgson had a stutter. He was an accomplished mathematician and a lecturer at Oxford University, not accustomed to formal settings like this one. Picture the scene. As he had to identify himself in front of colleagues, a disconcerting doubling phenomenon took place. It was not under his conscious control, but it provided an identification with, you will have guessed, Charles Do. Thus, with a good dose of humor, Dodgson, who adored doubling names, Humpty Dumpty, Tweedledee-Dum, and Tweedledee come to mind, identified with the dodo of his literary fiction, which does not mean that he is the only dodo present today. Now, apparently Dodgson, in his academic career, disliked lengthy meeting in committees sometimes called caucuses. No wonder that his self-ironic identification with the dodo turned into a satirical reflection on academic competitions dramatized in what he calls a caucus race. Alice, you will recall, is still wet from her own tears. The mouse had already tried to proclaim a dry, boring speech in order to dry Alice up, without much success. Just as proclaiming human sapience does not make people wise, so pronouncing a dry speech does not make wet people dry. It's raining today, so you can tell me later if it works. Seriously, the dodo, who like Diogenes is not an ideal Homo academicus, continues in more down-to-earth, pragmatic terms. I quote him. In that case, said the dodo solemnly, rising to his feet, I move that the meeting adjourn for the immediate adoption of more energetic remedies. Speak English, said the eaglet. I don't know the meaning of half those long words, and what's more, I don't believe you do either. What I was going to say, said the dodo in an offended tone, was that the best thing to get us dry would be a caucus race. Alice doesn't know what a caucus race is, so the dodo replies as a cynic philosopher. The best way to explain it is to do it. It draws a circle, and the animals start running from different positions without any order whatsoever. The dodo might be mocking the confusion of caucus races, including, perhaps, academic races. As my academic course took me from Europe to the US and back to Europe, running in circles more than once, I confess that a caucus race is not a bad metaphor. And yet, the dodo is also making a serious philosophical point. With Diogenes, contra Plato, the dodo does not teach via a universal definition, but via practical example. What is true for Alice is true for all humans. We do not learn in isolation, driven by an abstract and autonomous reason alone, or logos. Rather, we start learning via physical movements, often collectively, via relations of mutual imitation that engage both reason and emotion. Both are constitutive of a playful, imitative species that, supplementing Hausingha's Homo ludens, I call Homo Mimeticus, for lack of a more original term. Now that the dodo's race has taken us to what I take to be the driving element of literature and culture, let us broaden our field of vision. The connection between literature and imitation, or to use a more ancient term, mimesis or mimesis, is not a modern or contemporary invention, but that does not mean that the relevance of this concept has been fully explored. Quite the contrary. Since at least Plato and Aristotle, literature has been defined as a mirror or representation of reality, be it true or false. And this restricted definition reaches up to the 19th century, still informing the German philologist Erich Auerbach's magisterial book, Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western culture. This study traces the history of mimesis from Homer to Virginia Woolf via detailed analysis or explication de texte that, even in the age of the eye, provide a distinctive methodological skill for a literary scholar worth its salt. I regret, however, that Auerbach did not include a chapter on Carol. It would have made clear that for both the moderns and the ancients, mimesis could never be simply reduced to a stabilizing representation or mirror of reality, what Auerbach, echoing Plato in Book 10 of Republic, calls mimesis ranking third after the truth. My view is that already for the ancients, let alone for the moderns and the contemporaries, mimesis includes a much more destabilizing, embodied, yet truthful imitative reality. After all, already Aristotle argued in the Poetics that humans are a thoroughly imitative species. And in a paradoxical twist of modern inspiration, I add that we become sapiens only because we are first and foremost mimeticus. This is the driving hypothesis that informs my entire work, located at the intersection of literature and culture. In my ERC project, Homo Mimeticus, or HOME, my team and I opened up an interdisciplinary field of study called mimetic studies. Our goal was to study the contemporary manifestations of mimesis, including mimicry, identification, influence, plasticity, performativity, simulations, including mass identifications with authoritarian leaders. Undisciplined by disposition, crossing artificial borders dividing literary studies, philosophy, and the social sciences came naturally, or rather culturally, to me, for I was trained in all three. Moreover, I sensed early on via texts like Alice in Wonderland that more than one disciplinary lens is needed to adequately understand our constantly changing identities. While easier said than done, I'm convinced interdisciplinarity is a vital methodological principle to pass on to our students who are confronting a fast-changing culture. This is one of the reasons I'm so honored to have finished my caucus race at the Leiden Center for the Arts in Society, Lucas, which is unique in Europe in promoting interdisciplinarity as a key principle to understand the changing relations between the arts and society. mimesis is another term to designate precisely that relation. If it is often restricted to the aesthetic genre of realism, the mimetic turn we've been promoting returns to the ancient realization that mimesis derives from mimos, which means actor or performance. It is thus embodied and affective, if only because we are relational creatures who mirror each other, often unconsciously, not only on the side of art, but also on the side of life. With characteristic succinctness, another philosopher poet, or rather dramatist, Oscar Wilde, summed up this principle in his dictum my students know well: life imitates art more than art imitates life. Let me give you an example that includes academic lives. A ritual like this, for instance, provides a good illustration of how deep our mimetic instincts go. You can see it, feel it. You can even hear mimesis all around us. Silence is, in fact, automatically shared due to social conventions we learn since childhood by disciplinary forms of imitation. Bodies adopt neatly aligned positions for the same reason. This ritual is ancient and has been faithfully reproduced through the ages, and reproduction is one of the facets of mimesis. Our clothes mark individual differences, but fashion is an eminently mimetic phenomenon. And even if I'm dressed differently today, there is a striking mimetic continuity with my colleagues and predecessors. In short, this very ritual is a mimetic rite de passage I have the honor of partaking in. It's as if this imposing setting that brings back distant memories from my Catholic upbringing were designed to illustrate the power of mimesis. Mimetic powers that, from religion to culture, antiquity to modernity, continue to inform what Pierre Bourdieu calls the habitus of Homo academicus. In short, even in academia, there is no cultural production outside of mimesis. Or if you prefer a bon mot, since so many of the theorists of mimesis I further are French, il n'y a pas d'hors mimesis. There is nothing outside of mimesis, which does not mean we have to passively repeat what others have said. On the contrary, repetitions are generative of both sameness and difference, as tweedledee and tweedledum make us here, on the side of literature. Now, with this broader context in mind, let me return to the text that started my career. The sequel to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published 6 years later in 1871, is titled Through the Looking Glass. Dodgson not only continues Alice's adventures in a world of metamorphosis, he also reframes the ancient Platonic trope of the mirror by challenging stabilizing representations and foregrounding fluid transformations of a Homo Mimeticus to come. Far from reflecting a stable fictional image, or imago, which, as psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan argued, gives unity to the ego, Carroll uses the mirror to introduce mimetic continuities between life and art, self and others, human and non-human animals. It is a mirror that does not simply represent the same reality from a visual distance, as a tradition from Plato to Auerbach suggests. Rather, it is a looking glass that allows Alice to magically go through it with her body, without clarifying if it is the mirror that is permeable or Alice's body, or both, as a tradition that goes from Carroll to Deleuze and beyond indicates. The fundamental drive that opens through the looking glass is thus no longer the Platonic question of how literature can represent the world via a realistic mirror, however imperfectly. Rather, Carroll Dodgson, the self-identified Dodo, alternates between first-person direct speech, or mimesis, and third-person indirect speech, or diegesis. And this is the literary critic in me speaking. And it does so to open up a metamorphosis of identity by the medium of a mimetic affect, or as I call it, pathos. Here is how Alice puts it to her kitten. Kitty dear, let's pretend. And here I wish I could tell you half the things Alice used to say, beginning with her favorite phrase, let's pretend. Notice that Alice is not simply telling her cat to pretend to be someone else. As a mime herself, Alice is already caught up in a game of pretense that attributes both language and human features to Kitty. How does this magical transformation happen? The literary text itself provides the philosophical answer. By imitating a fictional character with pathos, rather than by simply representing that character from a visual distance. Thus, as Alice wants Kitty to become the Red Queen, the narrator specifies. Alice got the Red Queen off the table and set it up before the kitten as a model to imitate. Clearly, the drive animating this game of pretense that starts the whole adventure, and perhaps more than that, is a mimetic drive. Mimesis then does not entail a representation of the same. On the contrary, it entails an imitation of a model to become different. Pace Auerbach, this is the mimetic drive that brings fiction into being by a mimetic becoming. Imitation animates not only Alice's playful imagination within the tale, it is also at play in Dodgson's dramatization as he speaks mimetically under the mask of fictional models. By extension, a lot of what goes under the rubric of modern and contemporary literature is born out of mimesis, thus reframed. Going beyond narrow confines of mimetic realism, in which identities remain the same, Carroll opens up alternative worlds where it is possible to become other. Thus, to the objection of Alice's sister, who the narrator says does not find it realistic to pretend they are kings and queens, for there were only two of them, Alice replies with an enthusiastic mimetic excess, well, you will be one of them, and I will be all the rest. Who said that mimesis is limited to playing only one role? True, Plato said precisely that, but it's not our model today. Carroll, for one, sets up more than one model to imitate in the first place. Crucially, it is this magical world of mimetic pretense that is not only central to characters on the side of fiction, it is also central to the formation of characters on the side of life. This is, in a nutshell, the main insight the mimetic turn or return to an affective, embodied, and relational mimesis emphasizes. It reloads what German literary critic Walter Benjamin, half a century after Carroll, called the mimetic faculty, or das mimetische Vermögen. Rooting this mimetic drive in the phylogenetic development of human behavior more generally, Benjamin traces it back to, quote, the powerful compulsion in former times to become and behave like something else, which, by mimesis, still animates both children play and artistic play. Homo ludens mirrors Homo mimeticus and vice versa. In other words, Alice's mimetic faculty, which allows her to go through the looking glass, is not simply a childish game. It goes to the very origins of an old two mimetic species that, by this compulsion to become other, gave birth to literature and culture. We are now in a position to see, or rather feel, that there is an important lesson at play in the mimetic element that allows Alice to go through the looking glass. An effective mimesis based on pretense and causing a suspension of disbelief is the aesthetic medium that allows Alice's identity to become porous, so to speak, traverse the mirror, and enter Wonderland, a metaphor of the wonder of fiction. At one further remove, a reader, following Carroll's linguistic traces, we identify with Alice and go through the looking glass, the novel. Mimesis, in other words, is not only part of the message of this mirroring scene, it is also the very medium that makes this magical experience of reading possible. Which also means that mimesis is both the medium and the message at play in the magic of literature and art in general. Revisited from the angle of mimesis, literature is of course not limited to modern novels. Far from it. From oral cultures under the spell of magical rituals to dramatic performances from which mimesis derives its name, from epic narratives of exemplary models to imitate, to novels of maturation, of Bildungsromane, from cinematic shadows that reproduce Plato's cave, to the rise of TV series that catch viewers in a game of repetitions with differences, stretching to new social media that inform digital culture and are now reloaded by artificial intelligence or AI. It is always the mimetic faculty that, in its plastic adaptations, brings new fictional worlds into being through the ages. And yet, we should not forget the lesson the Dodo embodies. Mimesis goes beyond good and evil, depending on the models we imitate from childhood onward. The case of Alice encountering the Queen of Hearts on the other side of the mirror, for instance, reminds contemporary readers of the danger to capitulate by the same mimetic faculty to the magic of tyrannical leaders who put mimetic pathos to authoritarian use. The queen shouts, "Off with its head!" Other fictional kings shout, "You're fired," if you're lucky. If you aren't, you're deported to a prison in El Salvador. Hence my early warnings against reality TV actors who rely on the contagious powers of mimesis, reloaded by new media, to turn politics itself into a dangerous fiction. To come closer to our contemporary preoccupations, before concluding, let us acknowledge that Benjamin was right in connecting aesthetics and politics by the magical power of the mimetic faculty. However, he was perhaps overly optimistic as he predicted that, I quote, the decay of the mimetic faculty in the contemporary period. Exactly the opposite has happened. We are all going through the looking glass of simulations that are no longer mechanical and analogic, but digital and artificial. To recapitulate, Carroll's looking glass made us see and feel that mimesis is an effective magical medium that is central to entering fictional worlds from antiquity to the 19th century. A century later, it is a different medium, namely cinema, that provides the most revealing mirroring surface to reflect critically on contemporary culture. Please rest assured, literature does not simply vanish. It is just reloaded in a different medium that broadens the lens of literary study to include my second affiliation, namely film and media studies, which should now stretch to welcome critical AI. My welcome might have generated a sense of déjà vu. You remember that in the Wachowski's sci-fi blockbuster, The Matrix, Neo also follows the White Rabbit. This leads him to a threshold of his own world where he meets a mysterious character named Morpheus. He also likes doubling mirrors, as you can see from this image. Unsurprisingly so, as Ovid had already put it in the Metamorphoses, Morpheus is the skillful artificer and imitator of shape, stimulatoremque figure. Mimesis, as those glasses suggest, is once again the medium of transformation. Since Neo followed the White Rabbit, I shall follow Alice's advice à la lettre. Let's pretend, just for a minute, to be Morpheus. It's actually a dream come true. I imagine that you feel a bit like Alice now, tumbling down the rabbit hole. This is your last chance. There is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends, you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Let's take a look at Neo going through the looking glass.
Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
This can't be.
Be what? Be real?
It's going into replication.
Hey, Prof.
Still nothing.
Let's go. Let's go. Tank, we're going to need a signal soon.
Got a fibrillation.
APOC, location.
Targeting almost there.
It's going into arrest.
Lock, I got him.
Now, Tank, now.
All right, this rabbit hole is pretty deep. Still, this repetition with a difference reflects mimetic themes we are by now familiar with. Neo looks at the looking glass, and what he sees is not a stabilizing reflection or imago, which provides the one with one stable identity. On the contrary, the looking glass is liquid and can be traversed, or rather, it is the mimetic digital self that is liquefying. And what Neo finds on the other side of the mirror is what Morpheus, echoing media theorist Jean Baudrillard, calls the desert of the real. As he explains to Neo, at some point in the early 20th century, all of mankind marveled at our magnificence as we gave birth to AI. He then tells Neo that AI is using humans as a source of energy to power a neural interactive simulation qua matrix that is metaphorical of the internet and the AI revolution. As I already mentioned, the matrix is everywhere. It is all around us, even now, in this very room. The field appeared in 1999, well before ChatGPT and other large language models, or LLMs, that simulate what we thought made sapiens original, namely language, logos. And yet it anticipates what the godfather of AI, Nobel Prize winner Geoffrey Hinton, now considers a real possibility: AI taking over and turning us into dodos. As the term science fiction indicates, the boundaries between science and fiction are porous, like the looking glass. Not only are literature and culture changing via mimetic or rather hypermimetic media, we are also changing as we interact with these media. When I went down the academic rabbit hole over 20 years ago, mimesis was considered an original topic restricted to a passé literary genre. AI simulations encourage new generations of scholars in the humanities to think again. From algorithmic media that reinforce pre-existing beliefs to deepfakes, AI companions to LLMs that produce passing simulations of academic papers, mimesis is indeed everywhere. Perhaps AI generated this very lecture. Who knows? Honestly, I didn't think about it until I typed this sentence. And that's the reason I keep typing myself. Writing is the womb of thought. In any case, the digital age has taken Homo digitalis to a wonderland of simulations that are far removed from reality indeed. And yet, this does not mean that it's no longer a question of imitation, as Baudrillard claims. On the contrary, AI simulation retroact on all human bodies and mimetic brains, influencing our beliefs, thoughts, and actions in unprecedented ways. Hence the urgency of developing new mimetic studies to face phantoms that have already taken possession of more than one ego. Welcome to the reality of hypermimesis. Going through the looking glass of art allows us to return back to life and answer this cultural question. Why is Homo sapiens so prone to believing fictions, be they good or bad, true or false? For many reasons, or rather affects, but also because humans are relational, affective, and mimetic creatures who easily identify with others, be they human or non-human. Call it the Dodo or Dodgson, the Queen of Hearts or Trump, Morpheus or Alexa, ChatGPT, Gemini, Grok, or whatnot. Finally, if we join our literary and philosophical lenses, the paradox Alice in Wonderland makes us see and feel takes the following circular form. Our mimetic faculty has the power to animate fictional simulations, which, once effectively loaded, have the hypermimetic power to influence us in return. If you go through this paradoxical loop, we begin to understand why scenarios that were considered science fiction only a decade ago, falling in love with chatbots, believing to be trapped in the Matrix, reality TV hosts becoming presidents, among other hypermimetic phenomena, are now a reality. If fiction takes us through the looking glass, criticism should give us a wake-up call. At the end of the journey, if you wondered why the study of literature in the broadest sense is still relevant to contemporary culture, the answer is now in sight. Literature and its new media avatars provide a self-reflecting mirror that reloads the untimely philosophical question of self-knowledge. Asking this ancient, yet still modern and strikingly contemporary question, I've claimed, is vital to reflect critically on who we are and can possibly still become. All right, now a word of thanks to all who supported my race in the caucus race. Thank you all who contributed to my appointment, especially the executive board, the faculty of the Humanities, and Luca's management team. While I cannot mention everyone by name, it's a pleasure to thank both Luca's former and current scientific directors, Professor Sibyl Lames and Professor Stein Busselt, as well as the hiring commission, which responded gamely to my jokes. Homo ludens has indeed mirroring affinities with Homo Mimeticus. I'm thrilled to have a double affiliation in both literary studies and film and media studies, with fantastic colleagues with whom I enjoy co-teaching courses on European modernism, crisis, world literature, and many others. On the side of philosophy, I warmly thank Hermann Siemens for bringing me to Leiden already 20 years ago, the participant in the Nietzsche seminar for keeping me sharp, and Professor Susanna Lindberg, a strong ally in mimetic studies. As a teacher, I draw daily inspiration from my students, from BA to MA to PhDs. You remind me every day of the importance of being adventurous. And over the years, I myself benefited from a long chain of exemplary teachers. At the University of Lausanne, I was first introduced to Alice by Maestro Vermeer. Dear Roloff, I will never forget your dramatization of the caterpillar's untimely question. Who are you? I was then given brilliant introductions to literary theory by Professor Peter Halter, to anthropology by Professor Monder Kilani, and to philosophy by Professor Raphael Celis. At the University of York, Professor Dollymore showed me it's possible, actually necessary, to combine literature and philosophy. Dear Jonathan, your dissonant letter was a strong wind that pushed me from Europe to the States and back to the University of Cambridge, where I spent a memorable year at Pembroke College. And at the University of Washington, I followed two philosopher critics down the mimetic rabbit hole. Professor Staten, dear Henry, your critical standards were so high that when I started publishing articles in peer-reviewed journals, they were accepted without critiques. It didn't last, so the merit was all yours. Professor Borch-Jacobsen, cher Michael, you attached me to a long chain of mimetic thinkers from Plato to Lacour-Labarthe, in the most inspiring of theoretical settings, Paris in the fall. Those iron rings still magnetize my work, generating an enthusiasm fou. Professor Handwerk, dear Gary, you provided the ethical irony that kept me going through financial crisis with optimism. And then the debt to my editor at Michigan State University Press, Ochleerde Johnson, is unparalleled. Dear Bill, I simply owe you the existence of most of my books, and thus of mimetic studies, which are now amplified by the wonderful team at Leuven University Press. And in my caucus race, I was blessed with a multitude of guardian angels across disciplines who joined mimetic studies and became friends. Some sadly passed. Others I know are following online. Professor Connolly, Professor Bennett, dear Bill, dear Jane, you made my stay at Johns Hopkins so rich, and our reading group was memorable. Ochleerde de Vries, Professoressa Maratti, beste hand, cara Paula, you and the Humanities Center kept the theorist in me strong. Professoressa Cavarero, carissima Adriana, grazie mille for being so sympathetically inclined towards my Mimesis. Madame la Professeure Malabou, chère Catherine, thanks for being game, enjoying imitation and plasticity with the gender mimesis team. And thank you all who joined the adventure of home. The mimetic return worked in my homecoming, or nostos. Lastly, you might wonder why I brought along this Dodo here, which has been patiently sitting. My Mimesis has no single origins. In my case, there are at least double. I've known this Dodo since I was a child, as it stood as a model to imitate in my bedroom. So many have asked me over the years where my name comes from, and you shouldn't be surprised to hear it comes straight out of Mauritius, of course. Dodgson was not the only one identifying with the Dodo, after all. I would like to thank my father who is watching online. Your Mauritian heritage, I came to realize, gave me the strength to swim against strong academic currents. My race was privileged compared to the journey that took my ancestors from India to Mauritius, slavery to freedom. I'm proud today that the Mauritian side of my family, my brothers and sisters, cousins, aunts, and uncles can participate online in this event, watching from London, Beaubassin, and Mocha. We laugh again, Pritam. And then there is the second, maternal side, the one that brought back the Dodo from Wonderland. My mother is sitting here in the front row today with a broken arm, but oh boy, what an adventurous spirit. Dear Mom, 50 years ago, you embarked on a magical adventure. It led you from a small village in the Swiss Alps to London, and then you tumbled down all the way to Mauritius. Yes. When you returned, you brought back the Dodo and, well, me. And it had been for your heroic efforts, redoubled by my grandparents up in Prepiantou, where I still meet my closest friends, I would not be here today. Grazie per portar sto Dodo, Mom. Last but not least, I would have stopped the caucus race long ago and had not been blessed with a magical artistic partner who ran more vigorously than I ever could to make it all worked out beautifully. In the long run, that is for over 20 years. Meine Michi, you fought the hard battles in the real world while I was stuck in Wonderland. Every day, you bring the perfect mix of magic, intelligence, and comedy in my life. Danke, Michi. Du hast alles gezaubert. My wonderful children, Kim and Nia, you've been my masters in mimetic subject matters. You make me proud every day as you shoot up like telescopes. This Dodo is already yours, of course. Every tale needs an ending. I leave the last words to the Dodo, who seeing everyone was out of breath, proclaimed solemnly, "The race is over." All the other animals crowded round it, panting and asking, "But who has won?" This question the Dodo could not answer without a great deal of thought, and it stood for a long time with one finger pressed upon its forehead, the position in which you usually see Shakespeare's in the picture of him. If you doubt that the Dodo is a mimetic double of the writer, here you have it. At last, the Dodo said, everybody has won, and all must have prizes. After such a long-winding speech, we should all be quite dry. Let's wet our throats together with some drinks. Je hebt gezegd.